Good afternoon. So I'm Ann Leonard, Manton Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the Clark, and it is my great pleasure to introduce the opening lecture for the Clark's newest exhibition, Pastoral on Paper. And as you may know, the curator of this exhibition is William Satloff, who is a class of 25 member of the MA program in art history, co-sponsored by the Clark and Williams College. And William received his BA in art history and studio art from Washington University in St. Louis in 2022. And after his graduation in June from the MA program here, he will begin a year-long internship in the Department of Drawings at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. So congratulations on that, William, and also on your exhibition. Because since fall 23, when William arrived at the Clark, he has been working with me in the Manton Studies Center for Works on Paper. And so, among many other things, I want to thank him for his service to our department, part of which was, of course, preparing the exhibition that he's about to tell you about, but doing many, many other things as well. And so I just want to congratulate him, of course, on this exhibition and thank him again for his careful preparation. He was involved in all the aspects of preparing the exhibition, from at the very beginning, scouting out some loans from regional collections, institutions, library and museum collections in Massachusetts. And, of course, writing all the exhibition texts. He wrote all the app content. He was involved in multiple meetings, getting the graphic design in the exhibition just right. And, of course, he has been preparing the lecture that you're about to hear, all on top of preparing a qualifying paper for his final year in the MA program. So he's had a very full plate. And, again, I want to thank you and congratulate you, William, on all that you've done. And if the subject matter interests you, as I'm sure it will, you might want to come back for more. We have a lecture by Paul Holberton called A History of Arcadia in Art and Literature, and that is also the title of a major book that Paul Holberton has written. That's happening here Saturday, the 12th of April at 11 a.m. So I think we all have a lot to learn about the pastoral in Arcadia. It's a very nice concept to think about at almost any time of the year, but particularly when we've come through a rough winter and are looking forward to spring and summer in the Berkshires. So with that, again, thank you, William. Congratulations, and please join me, all of you, in welcoming William to the podium.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Anne. Before I begin, I would like to thank the leadership of the Clark for this opportunity to curate an exhibition. It's quite rare for someone who's still getting their master's to be able to put on a show like this. I'd also like to thank the Clark staff who helped design and produce Pastoral on Paper, and special thanks to Ann Leonard, Manton Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs, for guiding me throughout this process. Due in large part to the revival of ancient pastoral poetry during the Renaissance, the idyllic tranquility of the lives of shepherds became a prominent subject in literature, music, and the visual arts throughout the early modern period. Dotted with ruins and cottages and populated by an interchangeable cast of cows, mules, maidens, sheep, shepherds, and swine, pastoral landscapes were vistas of desire and reflection. Desire, in that early modern viewers regarded these idealized landscapes as places of plenitude from which they could escape the burdens and obligations of their daily lives. Desire, and that these fictive spaces offered opportunities to play out fantasies of leisure and eroticism. Pastoral pictures were also sites of reflection, in that they frequently encouraged viewers to consider their relationships with the land, and especially in the 17th century, to consider their relationships with their own mortality. Pastoral on Paper examines how artists represented rural life, with special attention to how artists translated the real countryside before them into seductive pastoral landscapes of ease and contentment. Drawn primarily from the Clark strong holdings of drawings by Claude Lorraine and Thomas Gainsborough, and supplemented with key loans from the Williams College Museum of Art, Harvard Art Museums, and Smith College Special Collections, this exhibition disassembles the pastoral into its formal constituent parts, namely, idealized landscapes, architectural features, and human and animal staffage, to examine how artists put them back together to transport us to their own visions of Arcadia. The first section of Pastoral on Paper is called Accessing Arcadia. The term Arcadia derives from the mountainous Greek province of the same name, and according to myth, it was the domain of Pan, the goat-legged god of pastures and woodlands. In antiquity, Arcadia was known for its population of pastoralists, cowherds, goatherds, shepherds, and swineherds, who were celebrated across the ancient world for their skillful singing that they did while tending their flocks. In this etching, the Dutch artist Nicolaes Berchem conjures up an afternoon in Arcadia. A shepherd has brought his cows and goats to drink from a stream on a warm, bright day. The animals wade in the water, dignified and serene. A cow looks out to us, the viewers, as water drips from its mouth and it flicks its tail. A group of Arcadians rests leisurely by the water's edge. The shepherd, recognizable by his long pole, talks with a seated man who has come to fill his jug, while a woman washes her feet in the stream. To the far right of the composition, a goat slumbers in the sun, and a pair of women smile, lost in conversation. A stone ruin occupies the middle ground, its crumbling masonry overgrown with vegetation. Beneath the vines, there is a shadowy relief carving of a knight on horseback slaying a monster, an ambiguous reference to a gallant past. The Latin poet Virgil, who lived in the 1st century before the Common Era, wrote an immensely influential set of 10 poems, the Eclogues, about the herdsmen of Arcadia. In the Renaissance, 1,500 years later, the intellectual movement known as humanism brought renewed interest in the culture, and particularly the poetry, of ancient Greece and Rome. Although Renaissance humanism waned in the later 16th century, Virgil's pastoral poetry continued to inspire artists and writers throughout the 19th century and beyond. Over time, Arcadia developed into a general term for an idealized vision of rural life. Beginning in Rome and Strasbourg around 1470, the humanist movement and its interest in reviving literature from ancient Greece and Rome coincided with the burgeoning publishing industry. Humanists, like Sebastian Brandt, who edited the volume you see here, studied classical philosophy and poetry by ancient writers such as Virgil. Printers and publishers disseminated the humanists' commentaries and translations to hundreds of eager readers. In this edition, Virgil's pastoral poems are richly illustrated with large woodcuts. This woodcut illustrates Eclogue 10, which is framed as a lament for the poet Gallus, who is heartbroken over his unrequited love for Lycoris. Fortunately for us, the figures are labeled. Gallus lies beneath the tree at lower right, while Lycoris is on horseback at the upper left. In the pastoral paradise of Arcadia, even nature and the shepherds mourn for Gallus. The nymphs, fauns, and even the natural world sympathize with his sorrow. Gallus, consumed by his love and despair, wishes he could escape to the wilderness, living among shepherds or even transforming into part of the landscape. Despite the beauty of the pastoral world, his pain is overwhelming, and not even the muses can offer him solace. The poem ends with a sense of resignation. Love is inescapable, and even the most gifted poets cannot avoid its torment. Although the Eclogues might seem highly academic, and indeed they were for humanists like Sebastian Brandt, Virgil's writing began to bleed into popular culture. In this late 16th century engraving, the Bolognese artist Agostino Carracci makes a visual pun from a famous line in Virgil's 10th eclogue, omnia vincit amor, love conquers all. Amor is the Latin name for Cupid, the god of desire and erotic love. Pan is both the Greek name of Faunus, the shepherd god of pastures and woodlands, and the Greek word for all, which in Latin is omnia. Taken together, Cupid's victorious combat with the goat-legged god becomes a visual translation of Virgil's poetry. I should note that this engraving is often associated with Agostino's earlier series of lasciviae prints, or scenes of lasciviousness, lewdness, and lechery. In late Renaissance, early Baroque Italy, it was perfectly acceptable to tangle classical philology with mass-produced pornography. Agostino's work with the Pastoral carried over to his work as a commercial engraver. Together with the Venetian printmaker Giacomo Franco, Agostino executed the engravings for a 1590 Genoese edition of Torquato Tasso's La Gerusalemme Liberata, after drawings by Bernardo Castello. Jerusalem Delivered, as it's known in English, is an epic poem first published in 1581 that tells a romantic, largely mythologized version of the First Crusade, in which Christian knights battle Muslims to take Jerusalem. In the poem, the Saracen sorceress, Armida, abducts the knight Rinaldo to an enchanted garden within a hidden fortress on a magical island. There, she falls in love with him, and he becomes infatuated with her to the point where he forgets about the crusade. Agostino's engraving for Canto 16, shown here on the right, depicts Rinaldo in the arms of Armida. In the lower right corner of the print, two of Rinaldo's fellow crusading knights, Carlo and Ubaldo, have braved the dangers of Armida's island to find their missing companion. Armida's garden was an immensely popular subject for Baroque painters and composers, and was taken up by the likes of Poussin, Boucher, and Tiepolo, as well as in operas by Monteverde, Vivaldi, and Handel, among others. In the 17th century, Arcadia came to refer to a timeless paradise of plenitude. It was not geographically or temporally specific, and its ambiguity is central to what made it so compelling. For instance, the Baroque age gave rise to pastoral biblical subjects. The pleasant wilderness associated with the rest on the flight of Egypt often took on an Arcadian charm. Christoffel Jaeger collaborated with the celebrated Flemish Baroque painter Peter Paul Rubens to produce this monumental woodcut, which corresponds closely to the right side of Rubens' painting Rest on the Flight to Egypt with Saints. You can see it's mirrored because of the printing process, or relief printing process. Jaeger presents the Christ child sleeping contentedly in the Virgin Mary's arms at the edge of a dense forest. Two putti, or angels, wrestle with a lamb, while a third motions for them to be quiet. In the background, Joseph slumbers at the base of a twisting tree, while a donkey drinks from a brook. Altogether, quite a pastoral scene. This landscape, with its winding river, elegant trees, and a grand Romanesque castle, is an idealized vision of the countryside near Rome, where the artist Claude Lorraine spent most of his career. The tiny camels on the right hint at a biblical story, perhaps Jacob's journey into Canaan, but the other figures scattered across the landscape, such as the herdsmen, cows, sheep, dog, and fishermen, give way to another revelation, that the painting is essentially a poetic celebration of the bounty of the natural world. Claude Lorraine was a French-born painter, draftsman, and etcher, widely regarded as one of the leading artists of the Baroque period. Born Claude Gelée in the Duchy of Lorraine, which is why he adopted the surname Lorraine, he moved to Italy at a young age and spent most of his career in Rome. Claude was at the center of a community of Northern European artists in Rome, befriending figures such as Nicolas Poussin and Bartholomeus Greenberg. Known for his landscape paintings, Claude often combined classical ruins, serene figures, and distant vistas, blending natural beauty with a mythological sense of grandeur. His use of light and atmosphere set him apart from his contemporaries, and his work was deeply influential to the development of landscape painting and Western art. The Clark has 2 oil paintings by Claude in its collection. The one I showed on the previous slide, The Landscape with the Voyage of Jacob, which is included in Pastoral on paper, go see it, and the ovular painting in the upper center here, which is another rest on the flight into Egypt. A fun tidbit, that painting, this oval-shaped one, is the only known painting on wood panel by Claude to have survived. The rest are on canvas. In 2007, the Clark acquired a set of 16 truly exquisite drawings by Claude Lorraine. The drawings have a prestigious legacy, 13 of them having originated from an album assembled by Claude's heirs and sold to Queen Christina of Sweden. We can follow the album from Queen Christina to the Italian prince Livio Odescalchi, and then into the collection of the French Jewish art collector and dealer Georges Wildenstein, and then to the West Coast industrialist and art collector Norton Simon. They have a very illustrious provenance, these drawings. Pastoral on paper presents 10 of these drawings to the public for the first time since they were acquired. The other artist prominently represented throughout the exhibition is Thomas Gainsborough. Gainsborough was an English painter, draftsman, and printmaker, best known for his portraits and landscapes. Born in Sudbury, Suffolk, he moved to London in his youth and quickly gained reputation as a master of portraiture. Along with his rival, Sir Joshua Reynolds, he is considered one of the leading British portraitists of the 18th century. Despite being a prolific portrait painter, Gainsborough gained great satisfaction from drawing and painting landscapes. In his later years, Gainsborough famously wrote to a friend, quote, "I am sick of portraits. I wish very much to take my viol da gamba and walk off to some sweet village where I can paint landscapes and enjoy the fag end of life in quietness and ease," end quote. The second section of the exhibition centers on the idealized landscape. Claude Lorraine and Thomas Gainsborough were known to draw landscapes en plein air, meaning that they worked outdoors directly from the natural environment. Though both artists studied nature's features for inspiration, their approach to landscapes varied considerably. Claude's idealized drawings featured a diffuse light and airy atmosphere aligned with the sensibilities of the Italian countryside. Gainsborough observed nature through a different lens, focusing on the English countryside. Still, each artist endeavored to draw a more pleasing, idealized landscape. Claude would often add figures or trees in the foreground to create the illusion of deeper pictorial space. Gainsborough, too, would sometimes make adjustments to the observed landscape, for example, drawing a cluster of trees to one side to balance out a composition. Claude Lorraine was fascinated by how ancient and modern Rome melded into the landscape. The early Christian church of Sant'Agnese fuori le mura, which was built between the 4th and 7th centuries, attracted Claude on more than one occasion. By the 17th century, it was surrounded by farms and open pastures. Instead of showing the church surrounded by grazing animals, Claude used hills and trees to obscure any sense of historical specificity. While the identifiable architecture indicates from where the artist was sketching, the building's late antique style imparts a temporal mystique, evocative of Arcadia. The Caffarella Valley, located in the southeastern outskirts of Rome, has a long history rooted in pastoral land use. In ancient times, it was part of the Agro Romano, serving as fertile agricultural ground and grazing area for livestock, and it supported Roman estates that produced food for the city. In the Middle Ages, herdsmen continued to raise livestock in the Caffarella, and in the 16th and 17th centuries, Rome underwent significant urban growth, and the land around the city was increasingly put to use for the needs of the urban population. The Caffarella Valley, however, retained a degree of its rural character throughout this period. The land was still used primarily for farming, but as the surrounding area urbanized, the valley began to be divided into smaller plots and used for specialized agriculture production. In the foreground here, we see a herdsman tending a grazing flock of goats and cows. In the background is a large farmhouse on a hill, evocative of the Caffarella's division into smaller plots. Claude Lorraine often went on sketching expeditions around the Roman countryside with his fellow artists. On several occasions, Claude traveled west from Rome along the Tiber River to the town of Tivoli. Nestled in the Sabine Mountains, Tivoli had long been admired for its ancient ruins and scenic vistas. The German painter Joachim von Sandrart recounted an excursion he and Claude made to Tivoli. Quote, "We began to paint entirely from nature. The mountains, the grottos, the valleys, and deserted places, the terrible cascades of the Tiber, the Temple of Cybele, and the like." End quote. This drawing by Thomas Gainsborough is an atmospheric enigma. The sky is white on the right side, but left unmarked on the left side, where the beige paper shows through. The pool is mostly black chalk, punctuated by bold streaks of white, suggesting a stark reflection. Is the white a reflection of the sun, the moon, the clouds? The trees bend in different directions, and their canopies are drawn in two layers. First, there's the soft, blurry stumping. Second, the hard, black outlines. It's as if the breeze is ruffling their foliage. Gainsborough usually sketched the English landscape outdoors directly from nature. This practice prompted artist Sir Joshua Reynolds to remark that Gainsborough, his bitter rival, quote, "did not look at nature with a poet's eye." As such, he went against the prevailing tendency in 18th century England, where most artists still derive their landscapes from Virgil's eclogues and Claude Lorraine's idyllic Italian scenes. Fashionable collectors displayed paintings and prints of idealized Mediterranean landscapes in their homes, setting the trend of what was called Italian light on English walls. Edward Edwards, a great name, a professor who taught alongside Thomas Gainsborough at the Royal Academy of Art, described Gainsborough's mixed media process for drawing landscapes as rather capricious. Using a variety of materials such as black and white chalks, India ink, bistre, oil paint, wash, and gouache, Gainsborough, quote, struck out a vast number of bold, free sketches of landscape and cattle, all of which have a most captivating effect to the eye of an artist or connoisseur of real taste, end quote. It would seem that Edwards was more okay with Gainsborough's style than Reynolds was. The third section of the exhibition focuses on the architectural structures featured in pastoral landscapes. In pastoral works, architecture is often placed in the middle ground or background to suggest human habitation of a landscape. In the 17th century, pastoral architecture took the form of ruins, indicating that ancient people once held dominion over the land. These ruined buildings, surrounded by overgrown trees and shrubbery, invite the viewer to reflect on the greatness of past civilizations, the transience of their glory, and the sublime power of time and nature. In the 18th century, pastoral landscapes also came to include cottages, barns, and shacks. By including architectural features within pastoral landscapes, artists of the 18th century may be making more moral or social or political statements about the rural life and about how land is managed. It's worth considering how the appearance of a building affects the way we think about the people who live there. This drawing is an early example of Northern European artists' fascination with ancient architecture. In the shadow of the cavernous ruin, the figures look tiny. Trees grow atop the ruin, juxtaposing the persistence of nature with the ephemerality of Rome's greatness. Bartholomeus Breenberg moved to Rome in 1619, and shortly thereafter, he helped found the Roman Society of Dutch and Flemish Painters, called the Benvuechels. If I pronounce that wrong, forgive me. I don't speak Flemish or Dutch. And they were active from around 1620 to 1720. This intellectual and social group, famous for its drunken initiation rituals, included several prominent Italian landscape painters, such as Jan Asselineau and Carole Dujardin. Here we have a drawing by Jan Asselineau of some artists drawing outside, and above their heads, he's even titled it with the name of their social group. In this etching, two figures overlook a ruin-strewn landscape from a distance, allowing viewers to insert themselves within the pastoral scene rather than observing it as a spectacle. One of the foreground figures sits with a notebook and a writing instrument in his hand, suggestive of the sketching tours that 17th century artists took throughout the countryside around Rome. Though the figure is representative of the common practice of working outdoors, Carole Dujardin actually created this print back in his studio in The Hague. Jean-Jacques de Boisseau was a French etcher, engraver, and draftsman who specialized in landscapes and genre scenes of daily life. Active from 1758 to 1809, Boisseu's long career spanned the most socially and politically volatile period in French history. His work is hardly political in nature, and he consistently focused on rural and pastoral subjects throughout each decade of his half-century career. Nevertheless, it is interesting to consider how Boisseu's work might have reflected the politics of his time. Boisseu created this print, The Entrance to a Forest with a Cottage on the Right, in the years immediately preceding the French Revolution. We see nondescript presents making their way through a landscape that is simultaneously lush and barren. Everyone seems to be traveling, but it's not evident from where they come or to where they're going. How long have they been traveling? Are they approaching their destination? Their hunched backs suggest weariness, or perhaps a determination to keep going. The right side of the print is dominated by a dilapidated dwelling. Masonry has crumbled away to reveal brick, and the upper part of the structure has fallen away entirely, only to be patched over with scrap wood. The back side of the building, which faces us, is similarly fashioned out of mismatched, rotting planks. What is Boisseu trying to tell us here? What's he trying to say about the people who live here? Perhaps it's that the rural folk simply fail to value a tidy home, and that by extension, they cannot responsibly cultivate the land. Alternatively, this might be a sympathetic depiction of the rural poor. Perhaps the artist is drawing attention to the squalor in which rural peasants were forced to live under the labor extraction and land dispossession of feudalism. There isn't a clear answer here, but Boisseu is certainly offering us the opportunity to think critically about rurality and land stewardship. The final section of the exhibition focuses on the human and animal figures often featured in pastoral landscapes. The humans are typically herdsmen, muleteers, travelers, washerwomen, or peasants, and the animals are usually livestock, cows, goats, pigs, and sheep, or pack animals, such as donkeys, mules, and oxen. Although people appear to be at work in many pastoral landscapes, their occupations are represented more like pastimes than as strenuous labor. Similarly, pastoral artworks represent animals in a state of contentment. The cows are shown drinking and grazing, and there's no indication that they're being raised for slaughter. We might pause to consider to what extent these representations of peasant life and animal husbandry are realistic. In this etching, Nicolaas Berchem conjures a timeless scene of rural life, full of tranquility and contentment. A shepherd sits playing the flute, while a woman stands spinning raw wool into yarn. To the left, a charming assortment of animals enjoy the afternoon. In the foreground, a sheep rests his head on the grass. In the background, a cow bends over to take a drink. The print suggests a complex auditory appeal, from the shepherd's serenade to the carefree vocalizations of the stirring cows and sheep and the soft lapping up of water from the fountain. In this work, by Carole Dujardin, two figural groups, each comprising a herdsman and a few animals, inhabit the landscape. One group meanders up an incline in the foreground, while the other begins to descend behind a bluff in the middle ground. It's unclear whether the parties inhabit the wilderness independent of each other, or if they are simply the same group shown at two different times. The figures in pastoral scenes often lack distinct personalities and motivations. Rather, they serve to activate a sense of timeless, nomadic ease. This final section of the exhibition, which I've titled Populating the Pastoral, is also where you'll find several prints and drawings of charming contemplative cows. Claude was remarkably fond of drawing cows, and he produced several dozen cattle studies in red chalk or in pen and brown ink around 1640. Claude's sketches of cows, like his other studies from nature, were not typically intended as studies for paintings. Rather, we get the sense that he drew cows because he liked them. In this chalk and wash drawing, the artist was interested in how bovine bodies appear from different angles. Claude most likely encountered these animals on a day trip to the Roman countryside, where grazing cattle were a frequent sight. Here's another sheet of Claude's cow studies, this time from the National Gallery. A gray, windy day like today is a perfect day to go to a museum. Well, any day is a perfect day to go to a museum. But I encourage you all to spend some time in the exhibition and explore the pastoral landscapes and say hello to the cows. Before long, we'll have a pastoral landscape in our own backyard here at the Clark. Thank you. We have some time for questions. Oh, someone's coming with a microphone.
Thank you. It was an excellent lecture. I am particularly interested in what you referred to obliquely about rural poverty. And so you have Gainsborough, particularly with his fancy pictures, doing sort of peasanty people. I know that's not quite the pastoral. And then in Spain, you have Murillo with his quite obviously poor people in an idyllic landscape. And I just wondered, it's very difficult, obviously, to know what the motivation of the artist, or indeed the customers or the patrons, felt about this kind of thing. I mean, do you have any thoughts about that, this sort of ambiguity or ambivalence?
You're right. I mean, it is difficult to know what the artist is trying to tell us there, or if they're trying to do something without the patron knowing. I think historically it's quite a difficult question. I think for us today, though, they certainly offer opportunities to think critically about land use and class and feudalism in the early modern period.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit to two things. Claude Lorraine's etching and dry point about the four goats. There were two questions I had. One was, could you speak to what is dry point? And two, it was so long ago. Was this a radical type of departure in terms of someone all of a sudden drawing goats? Because they were functional, and they served a purpose, for people's survival with food. And the idea that they would be a focus point of an artist at that time fascinates me, and I wondered if you could comment on that.
Certainly. So I'll start with your first question about dry point. Dry point is an intaglio printmaking technique, and so intaglio as opposed to relief printing. Relief printing is when you carve into a plate, and then all that's left is inked up, and the paper is pressed to it, and so you get those marks show on the paper. Intaglio processes are when usually a metal plate is dug into or incised. So dry point etching, things of that sort, and ink is pressed into the metal channels that are into the plate, and then paper is pressed at a very high pressure into those marks. So dry point, as opposed to etching, dry point, you go through with a burin, and dry point. Yes, it's a kind of intaglio technique where you make velvety lines by pressing into a copper plate. And your second question about the four goats. I don't think the subject of four goats on its own was necessarily radical, although they were, yes, they were industrial animals, but also animals raised to eat. There's quite a long tradition of of emblems for animals and all sorts of things in the natural world. So going back, over a century before Claude, a goat would be associated with Capricorn, which is then associated with astrology and several other things. And so making an animal the subject of a work of art, I don't think was necessarily so radical.
Hi, thank you, William. I really liked the inclusion of Virgil's eclogues and the invention of pastoral poetry as a genre that dates back to, as you noted, a century before Common Era. And so I'm curious about in the process of curating the show, your relationship between poetry and text generally in the landscape, if that like informed your process in researching these works, because there is a certain obliqueness when you're approaching the landscape that, I think poetics can kind of supplement as well. But I guess my question is really about your research and also maybe more intellectually thinking about text.
So the research process started very much in Virgil, and before him even in Theocritus, who was writing in the 4th century, maybe 3rd century, I think 4th, BCE in Greek, about pastorals as well. And I was starting with all of these analyses of ancient poetry, but then at the end of the day, I knew this was going to be an early modern show. And I was looking for works where early modern artists were responding to and engaging with pastoral texts, but also pastoral themes. So the Berchem prince, for instance, I feel quite strongly that his figures are Arcadians, but I don't necessarily know if he was reading Virgil. But by the mid-17th century, Virgil eclogues had totally made their way into popular culture, and people, had a reference point if you said Arcadia. The same way, today you can say, oh, that's an Arcadian countryside, and it conjures an image of just, beautiful rolling hills and maybe some sheep.
Could you tell us about the process of identifying works from other sources than the Clark, from other museums, and how you went about that and how you identified them?
Certainly. So works or exhibitions for the Thaw Gallery, the Works on Paper Gallery here, are usually primarily drawn from the Clark. And I was really fortunate with this process. When I wanted to pull together themes for the show, there was very little looking beyond the Clark I had to do. Pretty much whenever I wanted something, we had work that worked for it. There were a couple areas that I wanted to fill in particular Dutch Italianate printing, and I also wanted some books. Some early humanist literature. And I tried to go for institutions that were nearby. So Harvard, Smith College, and Williams College Museum of Art, they're all in state. And I think we were able to pick them up in a van all in one day. So it was quite I set a certain geographic boundary for where I was looking, but here in New England, it's not a hard task to try to look locally for really great art.
Is everything digitalized so you could easily find out what was it, Worcester or Amherst or UMass? You just selected these particular works, or is that a arduous process?
Yes, to both. So many museums have gotten very, very good at digitizing their collections. I think works on paper are usually some of the last things to be digitized. Paintings always have an image. But I went to WICMA to see the print that we got from them before requesting it. But then, Harvard has almost all their drawings and prints digitized. That felt very easy. For the books, you can look to see that a special collection somewhere has a book, but you don't know the quality of that book until you see it yourself. Even if the book overall is in good shape, maybe, folio 31 on the verso, exactly what you're looking for, maybe that one isn't so great somewhere, so you have to go and see it yourself. Over the summer, I did a trip to Smith to go check out different editions of volumes that they had, and I mean, they were absolutely great, Smith Special Collections. So I don't think it was an arduous process, but it definitely required some in-person looking. I proposed this exhibition just over 11 months ago.
Thank you, William. I appreciated your comment. I think it was Gainsborough, but at the end that there was an artist that you could just tell how much they loved cows. And I'm curious, for you as a curator assembling the show, if there are works in the collection that you chose that you particularly love, that resonate with you, and what those are for us to keep our eyes out for when we see the show.
Thank you for that question. Yes, actually, the first work that I showed, I believe, the Breenberg. Okay, this one. This is probably my favorite work in the show. It's this one, and then did I say Breenberg? Berchem. It's Berchem's The Cow Drinking, and then Breenberg's Ruins from Harvard. Those two really stand out for me. And I mean, I have a bit of a personal connection to this piece. This was actually my first assignment in my internship, was to write the acquisition justification for this print back in fall of 2023. And so in a certain way, Berchem was, in my mind for the last year and a half, and I'm so glad to have been able to include it in the show.
Since we're looking at this painting, at this image etching, I wonder if you could talk about how you think about the role of ruins in the pastoral, because it seems to me there's a kind of sense of what once was, and that has a kind of reclamation process in the creation of the pastoral, which maybe is in some tension with the image of a kind of eternal, beatific, rural scene. So I'm wondering how you think about ruins depicted in these pieces and what roles they play for understanding the world.
I think it's Roland Barthes' term, the punctum, the thing in an image that draws your attention, but then makes you have a meta-reflection. I'm not summarizing that term adequately, but for this print, I think it's beneath the carved relief, you can see a vine going across that ruin, and you can see through the ruin. And I only noticed this a few days ago, and I've been looking at this print for a year and a half. But somehow this big stone structure has crumbled away enough that you can see through it. And structurally, I don't know if that actually could occur. And I think that's part of it. It's that the pastoral and its seductive quality, it doesn't hold up when you think about the transience of time. I think of Poussin's Et in Arcadia Ego. It's that things do end, that death does happen, that time does pass, even in these places that seem golden and seem timeless. And it's the way that utopia implies that it can't actually exist. That something has to pull us out from there. And I think ruins really serve that function, especially in 17th century pastoral works. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, and you may have started to answer this by mentioning that you wrote the acquisition justification for this piece, but how you arrived at this subject matter for your choice for exhibition and subsequent paper?
Honestly, it's the balcony upstairs looking out onto Stone Hill. There's nothing like looking out at the cows grazing. I wish I had a much more intellectual answer for you, but the Clark really is a font of pastoral inspiration. The gentleman in the red up here had a question.
I have a mic.
I was just wondering how the artist made a living. Was it primarily through a patron, or did they try to sell the output to the general public?
So, great question. In different times, different things. So the earlier you go, generally artists sought patrons, and the later you go, artists usually sold to an open market. Prints were a particularly good way of making money because you could make one matrix, you could make one plate, and then from that you get dozens or hundreds of prints from it. And so you're taking your artistic, creative labor and just generating much more income from it. So drawings generally aren't a great way to make money or weren't a great way to make money for early modern artists because they're pretty small. You can't frame them up all big and nice like a painting, and there's only one of them. So often the drawings are just for the artists. So Gainsborough, for instance, never sold a drawing. He just did drawings for himself. And Claude, he generally kept them for himself, sold some, gave many as gifts, gifts of gratitude to patrons and buyers. Yeah, thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Oh my gosh. How do you see this exhibition in the specific context of the Berkshires, which is an area that, as you say, is sort of a pastoral example but that one that many people come to, for school or for retirement, but come for like the serene beauty, and in it come and change it a little bit.
Yes, I think that's the point of the exhibition, actually, is to have the Clark's visitors think about what their relationship is to the Berkshires as they live here or as they move through here. That's not the only point. The point is, of course, all of this great art. But I do want people to leave the exhibition thinking about the land around them and how they relate to it, how they engage with it, and how they relate to people who work this land and live here their whole lives. Because you're right. A lot of us. In the grad program, I'm here for 2 years, and then then I'm off to LA after this. So it's been a quick moment for me in the Berkshires, but it's definitely changed the way that I'm thinking about the outdoors. Thank you.